how you doing? I hope you're all well. So today I wanted to make a video talking to you guys about narrative therapy. If you guys have seen my other videos, you would know that I do work in like a counseling setting now, so I do tend to use this approach quite a bit, and I attended a training on it recently. Alright guys, sorry I got distracted. So narrative therapy, yeah, I attended a training on it just recently, and I just learned a few things and I thought I'll share with you guys. I'm going to make this video as simple and as straightforward as possible because I feel like most of the people that watch my channel are social work students or are now going to become social workers, so I'm not going to go too in-depth into it. I'll leave some links below if you guys are wanting to read further on narrative therapy. But yeah, let's get right into it. I'm going to do a bit of an introduction, and then I'm going to go through the steps that a counselor will use if they're working with someone using narrative therapy, and then I'll give an example in the end. So yeah, let's get right into it. So narrative therapy, I'm not going to give necessarily like a straightforward description about it. I'm just going to give some characteristics of it. Okay, and pardon me if I keep looking down because, as you know, I've got my stuff written down. So yeah, it's a very strength-based approach. It acknowledges that people are experts of their own lives. So I mean, generally counseling acknowledges that people are experts of their own lives anyway, but narrative therapy, yeah, is one of the approaches that a counselor will use in working with a client. So generally narrative therapy will acknowledge that when people are accounting for, you know, how they responded to a specific trauma in their life, they leave out a lot of things like, you know, their values, their commitments, and what their intentions were when they responded to that trauma in that particular way. They only see like a specific dominant story and that's it. They don't see all those other characteristics. So if you're working with a client as a therapist who's using narrative therapy, you help them to identify those kind of things, and you know, you help them to use that to form other stories about themselves. So that leads on to the next characteristic of narrative therapy. It's around like reconstructing stories and developing alternate stories as well, and generally those new stories that are formed will contradict the stories that a client would have formed about themselves in the past. In narrative therapy, as a therapist, you have to be really curious about a person's experiences and, you know, what's informing those experiences and what social structures are impacting on how they've defined themselves, or what social structures have informed how the client has formed their dominant story. The therapist that I worked that, you know, did the training with us used this analogy of panning for gold, where you know, you basically sift out all the dirt and, you know, you find out all the good stuff and use it to make a new story about the client. So that's another analogy I guess you can look at in talking about narrative therapy. So panning for gold apparently is a way of mining where, you know, the miners will you know, pick up dust and they just sift it until they can find the gold. So that's basically what you're doing when you're working with a client using narrative therapy. And also it involves, you know, once you've identified these new alternate stories, you can link clients into the other community programs or support groups that can help emphasize these new stories that have been formed about the client. So that's all part of the narrative therapy approach. And I suppose on the part of the client, it's quite helpful if they're flexible enough to let go of a train of thoughts that doesn't serve them anymore, and, you know, have the willingness to jump onto a new train of thought that may be more helpful and more positive for them. Yeah, so that was basically, you know, a brief introduction and identifying the characteristics of narrative therapy. Now, the steps involved in narrative therapy. So if you went to a counselor to get counseling and the counselor was using a narrative therapy approach, I guess the most important thing will be the relationship building and, you know, building rapport and empathy, all that stuff. That would be the beginning stages of that. And ensuring that a safe space is created for the client as well. This is very important when you're working with trauma. So that'll be the first step. The next step will be getting the client to, I guess, talk to you about their response to, you know, a particular traumatic event that had happened, and, you know, I guess the reason why they've come to see you in the first place. Talking about, yeah, what, you know, what their experiences were in that particular traumatic event, what they did as a result of that, and that kind of thing. And at this point, as a counselor, you do a lot of double listening. So you're listening to the traumatic side of what has happened for the client, but at the same time you're looking out for those values and those commitments and those intentions that the client may not necessarily identify with, even though it's something that happened when they were responding to that particular traumatic event. Oh my god, I have something in my eye. I had an eyelash or something in my eye. Anyway, the next step is to externalize the problem and seeing the problem as the problem. A lot of therapists will tend to identify the problem as a third person, like identifying as that maybe the sleeplessness at night, or the shouting, or the, I don't know, the hitting, whatever, rather than your hitting or your, you know, you separate it from the person. The problem is the problem and the person is the person. And I suppose that way it opens like a room for new perspectives to be formed, and that's the whole point of narrative therapy. So, and when you separate the person from the problem as well, it gives an opportunity for you to identify, you know, how dominant stories can be formed due to social structures that may be in place as well. And then the next thing is to deconstruct the problem. So deconstructing the problem can help you identify truths and, you know, other narratives that the clients may not necessarily identify with yet, and that will help you in putting together the new stories and the new alternate stories. And I suppose from this point on, the next thing is to also identify other significant aspects of the client's life that do not necessarily fit the dominant story that they've presented with, or the reason why they're there today. You know, there might be other stories that show them in a different light as well. And that will help you talk about alternate and, you know, other stories about the client. And the new stories that are formed are generally like contradictory to the stories that the client may identify with, and you know, that helps them to see themselves in a new light or in a different avenue. And the final thing is to, you know, incorporate or refer them to other communities and support groups that can help them you know, maintain that new story that they formed about themselves, or, you know, help them stick with that new story that they formed about themselves. So those are basically the steps that a counselor will go through. Obviously, this is done over a period of time. It generally won't be done in just one session, so it takes time for, you know, you to get from one step to the other. I mean, even the rapport, the building, and the relationship building, that probably would take one whole session anyway, so, or even more depending on how traumatized the person might be. So yeah, it does take a period of time for you to go through all those steps. Okay, so that's pretty much the steps you go through in narrative therapy. Now this is the case study that I'm going to use as the example. So I'm reading, so pardon me if I'm looking down. So Susan is basically a random person. This is a case study I found online, so there's no confidentiality issues here. So Susan summarized that after many years of witnessing domestic violence, growing up with a parent with mental health difficulties and suffering from effects of sexual abuse had led her to describe herself and her identity as damaged goods. Wordlessness and depression convinced her that she would never have any worthwhile effect on her own life or the life of others. Okay, so if you're using narrative therapy in supporting Susan, basically this therapist was using narrative therapy in supporting her. So this is what the therapist said. In speaking with Susan about her childhood, I was interested in exploring ways she had responded during traumatic times rather than seeking to learn exclusively about the effects and details of the childhood hardships. Okay, so with helplessness in her voice, Susan stared at me, stating, "I didn't do anything except stay in my room by myself, be alone in the dark, cry. All I remember is I just cried a lot, and I cried myself to sleep." I got distracted again. So now this is what Susan said. With gentle persistence in attempting to discover how she may have responded, I asked if there was anything comforting in her room. So Susan has started panning, not Susan, the therapist has started panning for gold in here, you know, how she's asking her about if there was anything comforting in her room. Susan then began to share how she surrounded herself with several of her stuffed animals in her bed to comfort herself. And this is Susan speaking. I remember the yelling and the cussing and the slamming of doors. It happened all the time, but when it got really bad, my father would break chairs, hit my mom, put holes in walls. I would take off all of my stuffed animals that were surrounding me. I would hide them under the covers, and then I'll close my bedroom door, even though I was afraid of the dark. I guess because I could hear everything, I didn't want them to hear because it was really loud. Sometimes I'll wrap them in my blanket. So she's talking about wrapping her stuffed animals every time that her father would get abusive. And then the therapist says, do you remember why you wrapped your stuffed animals? And then Susan says, I'm not sure. I guess because I felt more secure with a blanket around me, that I wanted them to feel secure too. I couldn't sleep without a blanket, so maybe I felt they shouldn't have to sleep without one too. The therapist said, how did you wrap them? Susan says, I would just fold a blanket around them really nice and tight, like you would wrap a baby. And then the therapist says, so you didn't want them to hear the yelling and the hitting, or for them to be scared when you were a little girl. Do you think that they could feel that you were wanting to help them through scary times? Susan said, I don't know. I didn't really think about that. And then the therapist said, so you just did that? And Susan said, yeah, I guess it just came naturally. And then the therapist says, this might seem strange for me to ask, but what do you think your stuffed animals thought about you, when you did things for them, like wrap them in the blankets and, hold them tight, close to you, and not want them to hear the violence that was happening in the background? Susan said, they would think I was protective of them. And then the therapist says, is that something they would appreciate or not appreciate? And Susan said, I think they would appreciate that. And then the therapist says, have there been times in your life where you've wanted to protect someone from difficult times or to help them not be afraid? So at this point, the therapist is, drawing on Susan's values or trying to identify values. Obviously, those values were going to help her reconstruct the news stories about Susan. And then Susan said, I was always there for my mom when he was yelling at her. When he got really angry, I would, stand in between them. I would say, stop, Dad, leave her alone, because I knew he was going to hit her. As much as I was afraid of him, I didn't like to leave my mother alone because he used to go crazy. My mom wasn't very strong. She used to cry a lot. She was always shaking. I was protective of my mom because when I was growing up, she always had nervous breakdowns. So I just want you to be mindful that and aware that Susan is basically doing all the work here. Even though the therapist is just asking questions, Susan is starting to identify other things about herself just by the counselor facilitating the conversation. So she's already identified that she was protective of her mom. Meanwhile, at the beginning, she felt she was damaged goods and that's all she was. So the therapist says, so you made sure you were always there for your mom so she won't get hurt. You never left her alone. What do you think that meant for her? If she was here right now with us, what do you think she would say about what that meant for her? Susan said, I think she would say it meant a lot to her. And then the therapist asked, is that a good thing for her to think that, you meant a lot to her and you was always there for her? Susan says yes. And the therapist says, and what might it tell me about the kind of person you are, that you didn't want your mom to be alone, that you protected her in many ways, and that you were always there for her? Susan said, I don't know, I guess I cared a lot. All right. Yeah, so that's basically the case study that I found. So do you see how the conversation started from how Susan identified herself as damaged goods, and as the therapist started to explore how Sarah responded to the traumatic event of her father being violent, and just finding out how, what exactly she did every time her dad will get violent, she was able to identify that Susan was a protective person and she cared for her mom a lot, and even for the stuffed animals that were not alive, she was still protective of them and she did everything to make sure they they were safe as well. But Susan didn't identify this in the beginning. And this is the essence of narrative therapy. This is basically what it is. So a client presents with a traumatic event and that this is what happened, and because of that they're this. And then you help them explore other things about themselves that may, you know, identify a different story to the story that the client is presenting with. Okay guys, that's pretty much it. I hope this video is helpful. Definitely give it a thumbs up if you enjoy it. Please share with your friends, or you know, I know you guys, a lot of you guys are uni students, so I'm sure you have like colleagues at school and stuff like that. Let them know about my channel. It definitely helps me out a lot when, you know, you guys share with your friends and new people subscribe to my channel. So please share and give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye guys.